Hey guys, we are doing a deep dive into different movies. We are going to start off with Meet the Robinsons and how adoption, foster care, and child welfare is talked within this movie. Now, I do want to make it clear, I am going to show some clips. I forgot some of these clips, and so while I was going through this, I was like, oh my god, I forgot this happened, and like, wow, this is a hot topic, but perfect for pausing while we're reading The Baby Thief, because this is really important. This is how it's affected even in movies, right? And how adoption and foster care and child welfare is represented. So while I do really enjoy Meet the Robinsons, and I think it's a fun movie for all, I think there are quite a few highlights in this movie that are both good and bad representations. I would say for me personally, it's more good in terms of not just the history, but the effects that it has. There's one particular scene that we're going to pause and talk about. But this also talks about orphanages. So this is set like before the 1960s, right? Although it's kind of set in the future, it's really the 1960s because, again, orphanages closed in the United States in the 1960s, okay? So keep that in mind. They do talk about that in one of the scenes. We talk about these children being interviewed by potential adoptive parents. We do have a loving social worker who heads the orphanage. She is good, but unfortunately not every social worker is like that. Like Georgia Tan was a horrible person. We can discuss the way that these children were really hoping to get adopted because they think the grass is greener on the other side, that they'll finally be able to have a mom and dad and everything will be perfect, right? And that's not the truth, right? Or the effects of what doesn't happen and how life can be. Now, I do want to make it clear that I have never been in an orphanage myself. There are plenty of adoptees who talk on their experience. I will not talk over them. If you are one of those adoptees, please, if you feel comfortable, let us know your experience down below. What are your thoughts and opinions? I think it's really incredible that we have so many adoptees willing to tell their story. If you're a birth parent and, you were in this situation similar to Lewis having been placed, let us know your story. This is not how most children were placed for adoption, but it does happen. And then lastly, we'll talk about the ending and how everyone will... He kind of creates his own family through people he sort of knows and all of that, right? That's kind of the whole premise of the entire film, is he meets all these people trying to find his mother, and he does find his adoptive mother, his adoptive father, and all these crazy, wonderful, relatives, adoptive relatives, but relatives nonetheless. And how, that worked out. So I do want to, before we get started deep diving into this, I do also want to make a note that Walt Disney himself adopted Abigail Disney. And while this film was created long after his death, there has still been an incredible impact on adoption in movies. Now, he is not the only adoptive father that creates movies. He's not the only hopeful adoptive parent who's created movies. We will, again, discuss all sorts of things. I just thought this was the best movie to get started with. So let's dive right in. The first clip we are going to watch is Lewis interviewing different adoptive parents, or I should say the adoptive parents kind of interviewing Lewis to see if he is the right fit. So let's get started. So here we already have these potential parents, especially the father. He's like, okay, like, is this kid going to be like me? Does this kid like sports? I'm not really interested in what Lewis wants or like is into, and I find this extremely first of all, in any form of child welfare, whether you're a teacher, a nanny, a parent, or anything, like, I want to make it clear, like, grandparent, if you have any introduction to a child that is in your life, right, and you are trying to bond, okay, especially with an older child, specifically, because Wilbur is, young teens, right, maybe 10 at most, but what, you guys get the point. He's still quite young. He already has a personality developed. He's into science. Like, he's showing you his notebook. Like, he's proud of something. That is what you should be asking about, right? Not, oh, are you into what I'm into? Like, that's very narcissistic thinking already. 2 seconds into this clip. Not literally 2 seconds, but you guys get the point. So I find that already. Okay, so, oh God, I have so many mixed feelings. So first of all, you could already tell that this couple should really not have children, the way that they interacted with Lewis. And I also want to make it clear that this was not the only clip where we see interviews with potential adoptive parents. We'll see another clip later where even Goob, who's the villain, and Lewis's roommate, also interviews. But we're about to watch a clip of how many interviews Lewis has gone through since being at the orphanage. Okay, so keep that in mind, that these potential adoptive parents are coming here to interview young children to see if they'll basically conform to their family, right? And as we see that children are not blank slates, we have personalities. We're very much like our family members. Now, we don't really get to know that in this particular story, but to have parents who are informed and supportive is the key goal, as well as loving and stable. Yes, all that plays in mind. And we're going to talk about that. But let's just watch this clip of Lewis talking with the social worker. The way that the social worker said was kind of the nicest way of saying, like, there are societal problems and your mother didn't have the resources to provide for you, whatever that looks like. Now, in society, as we've been talking about and reading and talking about resources, usually that is financial, emotional, and, especially with Georgia Tan, she would literally kidnap, children from impoverished situations and quote unquote rescue them, right? This is not that situation, but the way that the social worker is explaining, like, you are still loved, right? Now, I do want to make it clear that while I think that this is the nicest way of saying it, it doesn't mean it's necessarily the best way. It still implores, or it still gives a lot of trauma, right? Because you're still equating love to abandonment, which pretty much every adoptee does, even maybe without even realizing it. Quite often we hear, your birth mother loved you so much, she, placed you for adoption, right? Or she relinquished her rights to give you a better opportunity. And for adoptees, we often see that as abandonment. She loved us so much, she abandoned us, right? Instead of fighting. Does that mean she didn't love us? No, of course not. And that's kind of how Lewis is seeing it, like, oh, she loves me, like, she wants me still, let me go find her, maybe things are better. And I understand that. So in the next clip, this is kind of when he meets, was it Wilbur, right? And we're going to see him So we're skipping through the movie, but in the next clip, we're going to have him with Wilbur, and they go back to when his mother, Lewis's mother, placed him on the doorstep, right? As an adoptee, I can understand, this is the clip that plays the most in my mind on why Meet the Robinson is a great example for adoption, right? In terms of our feelings. Because because Lewis here wants to have answers. He wants to meet his birth mother. He wants to go back and ask her why, right? And I think a lot of adoptees feel that way. Not every adoptee goes and does their search and reunion. And I do want to make it clear, search and reunions are very complicated. They don't all go the same. I wish they did. From someone who's had two vastly different experiences, one from my birth mom, one from my birth dad, I can tell you that, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not rainbows and butterflies the way that, people also see adoption. It gets very complicated. There's a lot of feelings, and there's a lot of people at play here. So we're going to just watch that quick clip, and then we're going to talk about it. Okay, so as we can see, besides talking about multiverse and how that could literally mess up the whole thing, we can see that I keep saying Wilbur. We can see that Lewis really wanted answers, but also backed out. At this point, he knew that he was going to have this great, crazy, loving family, right? And the only way that he would have that is because of his future adoption, right? Or, in the future. He didn't know how that was going to work out, but his future. And he wouldn't have that unless that happened, right? And if he wasn't placed in the orphanage, that would never happen. Now, I want to make it very clear on that point. Lewis's want to search is completely valid. If Lewis really decided to try to reach out to his family at any given point, even after this clip, that would have been absolutely acceptable, right? But I think I also understand Lewis's hesitation, right? Oftentimes with adoptees, especially those that were not told or were told much later in life, or had to find out later in life, some of their adoptive parents, they kind of ingrain it in their brain that it's not okay to search, that you have to be grateful, that we gave you everything. And I want to make it clear that you owe no one your gratefulness, okay? You can choose to be grateful. If you had a great adoptive parents, you could still honor them, but that doesn't mean that you can't still honor yourself by searching. Just because you do a search and reunion doesn't take away from how you grew up and your love for your adoptive parents. And I'm saying this as an adoptee who has been blessed to have that support, who had an open adoption, who even when my adoption closed, my adoptive parents have always been supportive. Now, I do want to make it clear, I also felt that impact, right? So we call it FOG, fear, obligation, and guilt. We're talking about the obligation part. And a little bit about the guilt, a little bit about the fear, but mostly about that obligation. When I was searching, I didn't tell my adoptive parents, right? Even though I could have, I felt guilty. I felt like this weird obligation to them because of that. Even though they've always told me, like, hey, we'll help you search. Here's your papers. Let us know. They've always been amazing about that. But that doesn't negate our feelings, right? And sometimes our feelings within this fog, right, the fear, obligation, and guilt is so strong that people choose not to do search and reunion, choose not to get answers, choose not to be in, build relationships. And like I said, there are many valid reasons to search and reunion and as well as not to. But I just want to make it clear, using your adoptive parents as an excuse really is not valid, in the sense that adoptive parents really need to be supportive, right? Just because they raise you doesn't mean you owe them everything. You owe yourself authenticity. And adoptive parents, if you're listening to this right now, please support your adoptee. Try to keep things open. Try to have as much information for your adoptee and let them have access to it. That's going to build a better relationship between you and the adoptee, okay? An adoptee searching and becoming in reunion doesn't negate that you experienced motherhood or fatherhood, or you're the sibling of, or however an adoptee is in your life, a friendship of. None of that is negated by the search and reunion, okay? And I want you guys also have fear, obligation, and guilt, right? I want you guys to know that your emotions are still valid, but we should always be centering the emotions of the adoptee, because the adoptee is the only one that can never consent to any of this. Okay, with that being said, we are done with that clip, and we're going to move on and talk about more of Goober, who was the villain of the story, also known as Lewis's roommate, and we're going to talk about the traumas that children can experience. And as we see in this one, he turns into the villain, right? Often adoptees are seen as villains. We get villainized quite often in movies and stories, and so I think it's really important that we discuss this. So let's hear Goober's story. Okay, so here we have Goober, right, who is an angry person. He didn't get what he needed out of the adults. They weren't supportive. It seems like the social worker wasn't as supportive to Goober as she was to Lewis. I'm not saying that she wasn't, but we didn't really get to see that. Okay, so sorry guys, I got interrupted. We see that he's angry, which is valid. I was saying that the social worker kind of seemed like she forgot him or didn't give him as much attention. We only see these two children in the orphanage. We don't really see other children throughout it. But we can see that the same thing kind of happened between Lewis and Goob with the interviews. Not only did they not go well, but on the opposite end, where, let me rephrase that. While they didn't go well, it was kind of Goob who, the blame was being put on him as a child, right? Although we see that a little bit with Lewis in the interview with the couple where the potential father was allergic to peanuts. We see with Goob that they didn't know how to handle his emotions. We can also see him exaggerating that people didn't like him. He was forgotten at the orphanage. He didn't really know how to take care of himself. And that's kind of how a lot of people see adoptees, right? When we talk about those that don't have quote-unquote successful adoptions. And I say quote-unquote, when I say successful, I mean they do well in life, right? That's what I'm using as the basis for successful. And so oftentimes adoptees, like, for example, Loki, is seen as evil, right? That we're seen as the villainous character, or we're jealous, right? That there's all these emotions that we can't handle. There's a lot of trauma. And while, yes, those emotions can and are true, the blame should not be put on a child, right? It should always be placed on the adult who isn't informed and doesn't know how to give the proper resources to help, right? We're also talking about a child in this video that was forgotten, that was left behind when the orphanage closed. You know, there have been, as we were reading our book, there have been children that, you know, passed away, whether in the orphanage or after. There have been children who were unalived, right, by their adoptive parents. And so I want to make it clear that adoption is not rainbow colored, and that in this case of Meet the Robinsons, that they're seeing this as grass is greener on the other side when it's not. So we have that perspective. So I'm going to leave it there. The next clip we're going to go with is Lewis's adoption. And we're going to see a little bit of goob and all that, so I do want to make that clear. But this is when Lewis figures out his adoptive parents. So that was the very ending of Meet the Robinsons. As you can see, when he goes back to the present day, he figured out his adoptive mom, his adoptive dad, his potential, you know, his future wife, and it all played a role into his found family and his future, right? And I do think that's really sweet and like lovey-dovey and very heartwarming, but I also want to make it very clear that that is not usually the case with adoptive families and adoptive homes, even with foster care, right? Now, we're talking, this was in an orphanage. Orphanages closed in the 1960s for the room for foster care. The monetary compensation that orphanages got lessened as orphanages closed because of the less monetary from the money from the government. It went to foster care and so forth, right? So it was a switch in the child welfare system. But I want to make it very clear that there are still orphanages in the world, not in the US, not in the UK, and many other countries, but there are in other countries. And just because there are orphanages doesn't mean that the parents have died, okay? Oftentimes, as we saw in this movie, the mother could not physically care for the child for whatever reason, right? And oftentimes it's financial, it's lack of support system, societal, you know, during when we think this is originally set, women were not seen as good people, as loving and as caring, or as supported by society as a single parent as would a single father, right? Which is wild to me, but especially if you were a white woman, you were cast down upon. Now women are still cast down upon in society of all sorts, but not to the same extent as it used to be. There's a little bit more support there, but we still get some disgusting comments. But again, this is the idea of being rescued, the idea of rescuing a child and giving them everything, right? The same thing goes with these movies when we talk about adoption and foster care, and this is a prime example, right? Would Lewis have the same potential had his mother been able to, you know, preserve their family? It's a best guess scenario, and this is why we always say adoption is never better, it's always just different, right? And only the adoptee gets to decide that. So, you know, in Lewis's case, we can kind of see that he did decide that, like, hey, look, I'm I chose this route. I chose not to see who my mother is, and I have my found family, right? His family that grew from his now adoptive parents and his wife, future wife, and so on. And that's okay too, right? Having your adoptive family doesn't mean that your birth family is any less, and searching for your birth family doesn't mean your adoptive family is any less. Again, only the adoptee gets to decide. And there's adoptees who, decide that neither are best, and that they're best off, with just people that they choose to be their family via friendship, right? And that's okay. And that's understandable. Like I was saying, families come in all shapes and sizes, right? But we are talking about the best interest of the child. And while that's hard to determine through a movie, representation always matters. And so in this case, I think it has mixed representation, right? We talked about the good, the bad, and sort of the indifferent. But there's also a historical side that we're talking about, right? Being set in the 1950s, 1960s, when orphanages were still kind of around and then were closing down. And we saw that impact on Goober, and how that changed. So I hope that you guys learned something. I hope that you guys had fun with this video. We're going to do a lot more deep diving into media. I have a few other movies in mind. I have a lot of projects on my mind for this channel besides reading books. I promise. We're just trying to get through it all. I have a lot going on right now. But I'm trying to get all of the filming done as much as possible before October, the mid-October to November. I have something big going on, and I don't know how much energy or time I will have to be able to do a lot during that time, or the space to do it, I should say, because bad weather means I can't film outside, and means my house is crazy and loud. So we'll see, but I will try to get as much done before then. I'm going to have time next week to work more, get ahead of things, as well as September. So if you guys have anything you want me to cover, specifically movie-wise or a person, let me know down below, and I will add them to my list. All right, I hope you all have a lovely day, and I will see you tomorrow for another chapter in our book.